Let's continue on with what we had discussed from the last lecture. Remember our definition of sociology, that sociology is the scientific study of human social behavior. In the last episode, we talked about the difference between scientific reasoning and common sense reasoning or other forms of reasoning. Today, let's talk about what is social behavior. There are all kinds of things that influence our behavior. For instance, our biology influences our behavior. We're all biological organisms, and we all have urges and drives. How many of you, for instance, get grumpy when you're hungry? Or how many of you get loopy when you're sleepy? This is the way that your biology influences the way that you behave. And psychology influences human behavior. Things that are unique to your psychology, your personality, and your temperament. These are things that influence the way you behave. But what sociologists say is that net of the effect of biological influences and psychological influences, other people also influence our behavior. Our behavior is social. So let me give you an illustration that will point this out. Imagine, if you will, two identical twins, Fred and Ed. And the interesting thing about identical twins is, of course, they're essentially clones from one another, of one another. An identical twin is one fertilized egg that splits into two. So they would have essentially the same DNA, the same personality, the same, that physical appearance. They're as close to clones as you can possibly get. And let's say that neither Fred nor Ed are morning people. And they both take, and neither of them are very good at math. And let's imagine that they both take an algebra class that starts at 8 a.m. So here, Fred and Ed, the math-hating night owls, taking this algebra class at 8 a.m. And let's say Fred is in an algebra class with 100 students, and Ed is in an algebra class with 10 students. Now, given that information that I've just given you, who's more likely to fall asleep in class, Fred or Ed? And of course, the answer is everybody's going to say Ed. Why? Because Ed is more tired? No, not necessarily because Ed is more tired. Tired is something that you get from biology. Is it because Ed is more bored with the subject matter? No. Your taste for the subject matter probably has to do with your psychology, your personality. It's completely social. Fred constitutes 1% of the class because there are 99 other students in the class. It's easy for him to hide from the professor and sleep at the desk. Whereas Ed constitutes 10% of the class. There are only 9 other students to cover him if he falls asleep. So regardless of your biology, regardless of your personality, regardless of all other variables, just the mere presence of a larger class makes it more likely that someone will fall asleep in class. Okay? And that is distinctively social behavior. Just an example of this is just the presence of other people changes the way that you behave. You're never embarrassed when everybody picks their nose, and you're never embarrassed when you pick your nose when you're by yourself. But when you're stopped at a red light and you're picking your nose and you look over and the person in the next car over is watching you do it, suddenly you get embarrassed because you become embarrassed when you're caught picking your nose because it's not socially acceptable. And I like that example because why would you be embarrassed if a stranger saw you picking your nose? I mean, you probably don't know who that person is from Adam. You're never going to see them again. We're embarrassed when anybody sees us do something embarrassing. All right. So the presence of other people influences our behavior, or the social arrangements influence our behavior. There are a number of tools that sociologists use to examine social behavior because sociologists are usually talking about the behavior of groups. We lump people together into groups and look at the behavior of groups. And three that I want to go over are number one, the mean, number two, social location, and number three, social structure. And we'll go over each of these in turn. The mean, of course, is just the statistical average, the central tendency of groups. And we often examine the characteristics of groups and describe them by their mean. So, for instance, you might hear a sociologist who specializes in religion say something like, Catholics have larger families than Protestants. Now, when you hear this, you might say to yourself, now, wait a second, we're Protestants and there are 4 kids in our family, and the Catholic family across the street only has 2 kids, so that can't be right. Well, that's not what we're saying. Sociologists sort of insert the mean into their discourse in shorthand. When we say Catholics have larger families than Protestants, what we mean is that the average Catholic family is larger than the average Protestant family. Doesn't mean that every Catholic family is larger than every Protestant family. We know, for instance, that men in the workforce make more money than women in the workforce. And that holds true even if your mom makes more than your dad. It's not true in every case. It's just like if I say July is hotter than May. Is anybody going to dispute that the month of July is hotter than the month of May? No. But not every day in July is hotter than every day in May. And this examining groups by their central tendency or describing groups by their mean is different from a stereotype. And the reason why is because a stereotype is not necessarily based in fact or based on empirical observation, whereas describing groups on the basis of the mean is. Sometimes the mean doesn't even exist in empirical reality, even though it's the best descriptor of a group. So right now I can tell you that the average American family has 1.8 children. Well, there are no actual families out there that have 1.8 children. What would that be? Mom, dad, and their son and their headless daughter. You can't have 0.8 children. So what it means is that slightly less than 2. The actual mean case, the average case, the most frequently occurring case is something that doesn't even exist in empirical reality. So the mean may be a great description, even though it's an abstraction. Okay. The second is social location, and social location is a little bit more complicated. And I like to make an analogy that social location is like physical location. And the idea is that everybody who shares the same physical location tends to see the same things. Now, there are lots of ways that I can plot your present physical location. You are, on planet Earth, and you are in the Western Hemisphere, and you are north of the equator, and you're on the continent of North America, and you are probably in the state of Florida, and probably in Duval County. And so if we were all in a classroom, I could narrow our physical location down and pinpoint it. And if I pointed to objects in the classroom and said, what is this? What is that? You would be able to identify them because people who share the same physical location see the same things. Well, social location works the same way. Just as everybody is situated in physical space, people are also situated in social space. You're either male or female. Most people are either male or female. You're old, middle-aged, or young. You're married or single, rich, poor, or middle class. Everybody belongs to some sort of ethnic group. Most people have a religious affiliation. You're blue collar or white collar. These are all positions within social structure or within social space. And the interesting thing about this is that just as people who share the same physical location tend to see the same things, people who share the same social location tend to see the world the same way. And that is why people that is why, old people tend to vote for a particular political party because there's something about age and political preference that hangs together. Ethnic minorities tend to vote for a particular political party because there's something about being a minority and political philosophy that seems to predispose them to one particular party more than another. Women are more likely to vote one way than men are, and that's simply a matter of being in social space. And that because you are traveling through social space in a particular position, you know, certain ideas may seem more appealing or speak more to your situation. I mean, that's essentially it. And this idea that your social location influences the way you see the world is sort of the opposite of psychology. This is a gross oversimplification of psychology, but what psychology basically says is that what's inside your head influences how you see the world, that you have personality and temperament, and that this serves as a filter for how you see the world. So sociology turns this upside down and says that what's in the outside world determines what's in your head to begin with. The idea is that there are social forces beyond the individual. And the sociologist Emil Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, attempted to prove this by asking the question, what is the most individual of all acts? And he came up with the idea of suicide, that suicide is something that is extremely individualistic. It's something that most people who are planning suicide don't tell anybody about it at all. It is something that is deeply, deeply personal. And what Durkheim wanted to show is that even something as deeply personal as suicide has a social dimension or is a social act. And think about the sort of psychology of suicide. If we were to ask people, and we can't obviously ask people who have killed themselves because they're dead, but if we assume that people who attempt suicide are similar to people who complete suicide, if we ask them, why did you do it? They will probably say things like, I was depressed, I felt worthless, I had a broken heart, I was terminally ill, I was financially ruined. Like, these are the kinds of reasons that drive people to suicide. But what we find is that consistently, different regions of the country have higher suicide rates than others, particularly the Mountain West states, Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, have for many, many years had substantially higher suicide rates than the mid-Atlantic states that or that have traditionally low suicide rates. Now, if I take a state with a very low suicide rate like Connecticut, and I take someone who has committed suicide and raised that person from the dead and said, why did you do it? They would probably say, oh, I was depressed, I felt worthless, I had a broken heart, I was terminally ill, I was financially ruined. I mean, they would give you individualistic reasons. And if I took someone from Nevada who had committed suicide and raised that person from the dead and said, why did you do it? They would give me essentially the same reason. So at the level of the individual, you can't understand why these Mountain West states have higher suicide rates. So I'm not denying these individualistic reasons why people commit suicide, but these factors can't explain variation in rates at the aggregate level. Okay? You just can't explain it. Well, what does explain it? We don't really know the answer to that. Some people have argued that the Rocky Mountain, there's something about altitude that makes people more likely to kill themselves. Some people have argued that these are very high growth states. The darker green are states that have grown in population faster, and that there's something destabilizing about rapid population growth, that there's not a lot of neighborhood cohesion, or people don't live next to their families, and that this puts people at risk for suicide when they are depressed or terminally ill or their heart is broken or they're bankrupt? We really don't know. But I'll tell you what we do know. It's not like somebody is in their car and uh, driving west, and when they cross the Continental Divide, all of a sudden their spouse turns to them and says, "I'm leaving you," and they find out their bank account is drained and they feel a lump on their neck. That's just not how it works. You cannot explain variation in rates by individual behavior. Okay, and I think that's important to know. People also tend to think that everyone has a set of values and that these values are a blueprint for action, that your behavior is driven by the values that you hold. But what sociologists say is that the values that you have, it's not that they don't matter, but they're often less important than social variables. In other words, social variables can override these values. And let me give you an example. The If you think about family values and the importance of marriage, people who espouse these values are very concerned over the fact that in recent generations, the divorce rate has skyrocketed. You can see, starting in about 1970, the divorce rate rose dramatically into the 1980s, and it has stayed very high ever since. I don't think that area between 98 and 2007, where we're missing the data, would show that there was any great decline. So you have high rates of divorce. And why has divorce exploded? Is it our values? Do people value marriage less? Well, let's examine this. First of all, I want to say that 90% of people still marry, and the vast majority of those people who have never married wish they could be married, and most people who divorce remarry. And everyone who gets married thinks their marriage will last forever. There isn't anybody that gets married and says, "Oh, I'm so excited to be married. I'm going to give this about 9 months." So it seems to me that people approach marriage thinking it's permanent, and that probably means that they value it. But there is a wide variation in how people approach marriage with respect to their values. So let's think about the quintessential, stereotypical, progressive, liberal, non-family values state. I mean, what state comes to mind? In my mind, Massachusetts probably comes to mind. It's one of the most liberal states in the Union. It was the first state to legalize gay marriage in 2004, long before the others. And in a place like Massachusetts, divorce is pretty well accepted. People will acknowledge that, sometimes marriage just doesn't work out and you got to get divorced. And, everybody would know someone who has a divorced parent, or maybe their own parent, or they have a divorced neighbor or a divorced friend, or maybe, you've been divorced. And, divorce is unfortunate, but sometimes it's necessary and it's just a fact of life. Now, let's compare that to the state where I grew up, which is the state of Utah. And Utah, of course, is dominated by Mormons, and Mormons take a very dim view of divorce. This is a Mormon apostle, a guy by the name of Stephen L. Richards, and this is what he had to say about divorce, a Mormon church leader. Divorce contravenes the law of God. There may be exceptions to be treated with some tolerance, but for my own part, I am fearful of any interpretation which does not put divorce in the category of evil and sin. Spencer W. Kimball was a Mormon prophet, and he said, "The ugly dragon of divorce has entered into our social life." Little known to our grandparents and not even common among our parents, this cancer has come to be so common in our own day that nearly every family has been cursed by its machinations. This is one of the principal tools of Satan to destroy the faith. So in Massachusetts, it's just something that happens. Unfortunate, but it's the fact of life. And in Utah, a tool of Satan. Right? That's a huge difference in terms of the values. Well, how do these values affect the divorce rate? Traditionally, and for decades, Massachusetts has had the lowest divorce rate in the nation. Here you can see that the average rate for the United States is 4.6 per thousand marriages per year. And in Massachusetts, it's 2.4. The divorce rate in Massachusetts for this year, which is the latest year, is about half the national rate. And let's look at Utah, 4.7. Well, the national average is 4.6, which means that Utah behaves just like the national average. That the leaders of the church, Mormon leaders, decrying divorce as a tool of Satan, as evil and sin. It does not save Mormons from getting divorced, so it can't be the values. So if the values are being overridden, then what is causing divorce? And what sociologists would say is, let's take a look at social locations. Let's take a look at some structural factors. Okay. One of the first things that we notice is that there's a high correlation between divorce and how young you are when you get married. People who marry in their teens have very high divorce rates relative to people who marry in their later 20s. And what you see is the low divorce states like Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island that are in the green have the highest mean age at first marriage, whereas Utah is one of the states with the lowest mean age at first marriage. People in Utah marry younger. And they marry younger for a very obvious reason. In addition to divorce being evil and sin, premarital sexual intercourse is evil and sin. And so if you are a young person and you are in love and you're having difficulty controlling yourself, you should marry your boyfriend or your girlfriend so that you don't commit fornication. And there are all kinds of people in Utah that I know, my own nieces and nephews, who have gotten married to try and avoid sin. Well, in Massachusetts, that's a pretty stupid reason to get married. I mean, that's the way someone from Massachusetts would look at it. And we know that this age at first marriage is associated with divorce. So despite the fact that they think divorce is evil, getting married young sort of overrules it. One thing we know for sure is that children are hard on a marriage. Marital satisfaction is highest when the couple first gets married and declines with the birth of each child. Marital satisfaction tends to reach its nadir when children are in their teenage years. And then when they start to leave the nest, for people who have stayed together, marital satisfaction starts going up. Children have a negative impact on the quality of marriage. I mean, it's not a happy thing to say, but the facts are the facts. I mean, as a married person, I can tell you the two things that married people argue about more than anything else are children and money. And often children and money are the same argument, depending on, what it's about. And as you can see, the green states, the sort of dark aqua states, are the states with the lowest birth rate. And the blue states are the states with the highest birth rate. So Utah has the highest birth rate in the nation, has for a long, long time. So people get married younger, they have more kids. Those things are correlated with divorce, and something else is correlated with divorce. Per capita income. Look at Massachusetts and the Middle Atlantic states. These are the richest states in the Union, whereas Utah is among one of the poorest states in the Union. And I don't think I need to go into long explanation for why having resources can help your marriage stay together. It's very stressful to be poor, and money problems spill over into the marriage. Okay, so what we are saying here is that social location within the class structure, within the age structure, influences your likelihood of being divorced solely net of the effect of your values or the way that you value or think about marriage. That social location and social behavior will take place sometimes irrespective of values and overruling values. The last element that I want to discuss is social structure. How to describe social structure? Well, social structures are like physical structures. Think about the physical structures in your home. You have walls that impede your progress, or you have doors that facilitate your progress. A physical structure either stops you from moving or allows you to move. And social structures work the same way. They're like physical structures in that they either impede certain types of social interaction or facilitate certain types of social interaction. A classic example of social structure is military rank. And when two people in the military interact, their rank determines the interaction. So when an enlisted man encounters an officer, a particular type of interaction will take place. And that interaction will take place regardless of who the enlisted man is or who the officer is, because the type of behavior is built into the military rank. In this instance, rank is a social structure. It doesn't matter, and in this social structure, the officer outranks the enlisted. It doesn't matter if that's the dumbest officer in the armed forces and the most genius enlisted man. It doesn't matter. The enlisted man is going to salute because that's the way, it's built in. If you think about the South before civil rights, Jim Crow, these laws were social structures that told African Americans they could only drink from this fountain or sit at these lunch counters and things like that. And there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't have anything to do with your merit as a person. Your behavior is circumscribed by these structures. And social structures are often used to institutionalize inequality. And they're used to institutionalize inequality whether or not it makes sense. There are structures that institutionalize age-based behavior. There are certain points in society where you're old enough to vote, but you're not old enough to drink, or old enough to drink, but you're not old enough to, do whatever, run for the Senate. There are social class structures. Historically and in other societies, there are structures that impede people on the basis of race or ethnicity or nationality. So think about social structures the same as physical structures, walls and doors and stairs. What walls and doors and stairs do for your ability to move through a building, social structures do for your ability to move through society. The reading also talks about statuses and roles. And most people inhabit a bunch of different statuses or positions within social structure. I am a husband, I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm an employee, I'm a friend, and I'm a professor. And these are all statuses that I hold, different positions in the social structure. And statuses have scripts that accompany them for how you are to inhabit your status. And these scripts are called roles. You never see me in my role as father, but there are certain things that I do as a father that I don't do as a professor. You never see the way that I interact with my department chair because there are certain things that I do as a professor that I don't do as a department chair. And all of these different statuses have these roles that we play. And usually everything is copacetic. We play our roles and we act our part. But occasionally these roles can come into conflict. For instance, I had a situation where a good friend of mine, a close personal friend, became my department chair. And that caused some role conflict because here's my buddy who's now my boss. And that really sort of changed the nature of the interaction. There are ways that I wanted to joke that I couldn't joke. There's gossip I may have wanted to share that I didn't share because the friend became my boss. And interestingly enough, when this person ceased to be the department chair and ceased to be my boss, the interactions returned to the way they were before. Sometimes I might have a conflict between being an employee or being a spouse. Um, my wife might get upset if work calls me away from a family obligation, or if she and I might argue over who is going to stay home with a sick kid when we both have work, and that brings the employee role and the father role and the spouse role into conflict. There are two types of statuses: ascribed statuses and achieved statuses. Ascribed statuses are either involuntary or you're born into it. Your ethnicity, your nationality, these are things you're born with that you really can't do anything about. Some statuses are given to you involuntarily. You are an ex-convict. Others are achieved. They're assumed voluntarily. Your occupation, your major. Sometimes it is difficult to tell whether a status is ascribed or achieved. Is your religion ascribed or achieved? Most of you probably belong to the same church, the same denomination that you were born into. So in that respect, maybe it's ascribed, but you can switch your religion. So maybe in that sense, it's achieved. Um, Religious ideologies are inculcated from birth, and so they run pretty deep in most people. So in that sense, maybe they're ascribed, but you can abandon your religion, and so maybe they're achieved. That's what I'm saying is the ascribed achieved dichotomy is not always clear. Technology makes it even more difficult. Your biological sex, your gender, is it ascribed or is it achieved? Well, I would say for 99% of human history, your biological sex was ascribed, but now technology makes it so that you can fundamentally alter your sex and gender. Or what about social class? Uh, so many people die in the social class they were born in that maybe there are aspects of social class that are ascribed, but there's lots of mobility, so maybe it's achieved. So this is how sociologists think about statuses and the roles that correspond to them.